Let's see if that's better. Hello. Right then, I almost forgot something then. So, welcome to Naval History Live. Now, I'm filming in the evening, and I'm refilming this because I'm adding some stuff to it, and because, well, I just realised this new setup actually benefits when I'm further away from the desk. Right then. So, as you can see, up here, I have my lovely PowerPoint and all this over here because I have moved the camera back and I position things because I thought this way then I can point to things and sort of go like that or like that. The laptop screen, which I'm working from, is positioned there. And if I look very tired to you, I'm really not that tired, but we do have roofers going on, and the reason I'm recording this now at after 10 o'clock at night, after walking the dog for the evening, actually, taking for the research assistant for a walk, is because the roofers have been banging over my ceiling all day. So any time I've attempted to work in here today, I have got a headache. I love them dearly. I'm very glad with the work they're doing. It's just right on this part of my ceiling. They've had to be banging more than anywhere else in the roof, apparently, according to them. So, on we go. Naval History Live. It's a lot of fun though, and the roof is getting fixed. I think I'm going to move this closer. Oh, you can now see the computer screen just in the corner. I also have my mug full of the milk of human kindness. Because in other fun and otherly process explaining, nice, currently run out of iron brew. It's a scary experience for the world as much as it is for me. Currently run out of iron brew. More would be ordered, but I might have overspent my budget on books this month. But shh, don't tell the family. So, moving that to one side, what have we got today? If we can get it to work. We have got From the Sea, How Navies Influence Land Campaigns. Now, this is an interesting topic, and it's one which has had many suggestions of what I could use as case studies for this. So I've actually tried to include slightly more, which is why today's introduction video, is going to be slightly longer than I prefer. I know I actually have been. I'm supposed to keep them to 35-minute videos and break them up into multiple 35-minute videos. I will try that again, but I like the longer form videos of some of these questions, and this is one of those questions which I really do prefer the longer form video for. I really do think it's better. And hopefully all of it combined, including, as you can see, this to stop crackling, the mic here and everything, produces a better sound quality, so you will stay with me for what is probably going to be about an hour long. Thank you. Right then, let's start off. So, first off, bilge pumps. I think it was Perry who produced this particular meme, and I love it. I love it so much, Perry. I love all the memes, though. But the idea of battleships getting together as a council to decide people's fate. Although, I'm wondering if it would not be a council of battleships. Just bear with me here, right? So battleships are sort of the sage creatures of the sea. I see them as, in their sort of period. They're the wise owls. Owls form a flock of owls is called a parliament of owls when it's a gathering of owls. So I think it would be a parliament of battleships. That is my theory. But anyway, I hope you're enjoying Bilge Pumps. As you all hopefully know, next week we are recording with Michael Clapp. So the week after that, we are going to have Michael Clapp with the free regular Bilge crew to discuss the future of amphibious warfare. And for those who don't know, Michael Clapp was the commander of the Royal Navy Amphibious Task Group in the 1982 Falklands War. So, it's really, really cool. I promise not to fanboy too much during the actual recording. Although Jamie is already predicting, as you will hear in next week's to air video, podcast, he's already decided that me and Drax's faces suggest that we are already fanboying quite a lot. Actually, no, he didn't use the phrase fanboying. He used a different phrase. You'll get to hear it in the video. Podcast. Just excuse me, lots and lots of banging today. Lots and lots of banging. So, an introduction to the concept of how ships, navies influence the sea. And there are three ideas of sea power. Sea power is about more than just the liberal application of high explosive. Okay, this is going to sound strange coming from me, someone who likes to talk about tribal class destroyers, which are, in fact, most of their careers are about the liberal application of high explosive to various objects. But it is about far more than the liberal application of high explosive. It includes the ability, the freedom to move personnel and material still wherever, as at will, wherever a nation that has it so chooses. This is the point. And this is what I find funny when people start talking about ships they want to build and concepts, and they're going smaller and they want to have lighter and smaller and lighter. The whole benefit of sea power is you don't have to go small and light. You can take an entire commando plus its attachments that would, form equivalent to what it would have in a brigade to call on, and all their heavy equipment, and have them at sea. You can. You can also, using the vessel, the landing craft, and the helicopters you might be carrying if you've got an LHD, and maybe Vistal aircraft as well, fixed-wing aircraft, or Osprey-like things, or whatever the next future lift ones are. You can, using those, posture from quite a long way away and reach out and land that light force. And then get closer and land a heavy force if it needs the support. The thing is, if you design something which can only take the light force, that's your options. You're dealing with the light force. And to quote Drac, he has come up with, and I'm going to nick this shamelessly in an academic paper at some point. I will credit him with it, but I'm going to nick it shamelessly. The T-34 rule of defense. If your force could be overrun by someone breaking a T-34 or equivalent out of a museum, then you've probably gone too light. And that's the problem with going light. Light is good because it looks so great in the wars we've been fighting. And even some of the conflicts we're going to look at today in these things, light was good. Light was successful. But actually, when you look at it, light isn't all that turns up. Light is what might be in the front, but there is all sorts of stuff behind it, which makes a big difference. Really does. When you have light as your only option, there's a problem. But light as the tip of the spear works perfect. Anyway, it offers the capacity for intervention for presence without direct footprint or a scalable footprint at the wish of a nation that invests in it. For those people wondering why China is building huge LHDs, well, not huge, but decent sized, why Russia's building LHDs, why France has the Mistrals, why Australia has the Canberras. It's not because they like to waste money. Not a single one of those countries is in the business of wasting money. No more than any other government does. But to be honest, as governments aren't supposed to make profit, basically wasting money is an acceptable wastage is allowed almost. It's almost expected. Anyway, leaving that to one side, it's useful. They are useful because you can decide. You can sit offshore with your large units. Well, comparatively large unit of naval infantrymen if you're the Russians, and go, do you really want to hurt me? Do you? Because I can hurt you. Or more likely with the Russians going, hello, comrade. Behave. It's the fun times of presence of amphibious warfare. But the question is, and what we're dealing with today, is we're dealing with interventions from the sea. So we're dealing with things when they go hot. But there are levels of hot. And as you're going to see, it shifts in terms of what presence and what is actual direct war fighting. There is a very big gradient. In fact, there is an argument that most of these case studies are not from the angle of the intervening powers, the intervening naval power, are not full-on wars. Anyway, land wars, which the rules of the case studies, land wars which have been heavily enabled by sea power. There are going to be some surprises here. And interventions carried out with sea power. That is what we're looking at from the sea. It's going to be fun. This rate, I'm thinking more than an hour. So the Peninsular War, and to start off with, we are going to do this. Right then, you will find the link to where I found these quotes down in the bottom in the descriptions. But I want you to think about this. And I really want you to think about the second quote from Wellington right at the bottom. There are at Corona certain ships loaded with biscuit and flour, and certain others loaded with a heavy train of artillery and some musket ammunition, and I shall be very much obliged if you may request any officer of the Navy who may be at Corona to take under his convoy all the vessels and proceed with them to Santander. If he should find Santander occupied by enemy, I beg him to remain off the port till the operations of the army have obliged the enemy to abandon it. Now, the Peninsular campaign is a fun one, in that usually when I start talking about it as a naval campaign, people look at me a bit weird. But have a look at this map. It's a sort of periodish topographical map. There are an awful lot of very, very mountainous places. There aren't a lot of very good roads, and more importantly, the sheer size of the armies you've got moving means that if you are moving your stuff by the roads, you're going to have humongous logistics trains which can get attacked by the enemy. Wellington knows this very well because he does it to the French using the Spanish guerrillas. Now, here's the interesting thing. The British pretty much have control of the ocean, thanks to several little very nice naval battles and some Tribune fighting by the Royal Navy and a whole lot of luck. Now, whilst it does actually have a lot of problem with privateers, And Wellington is regularly having trouble with the Royal Navy in that he never feels they send big enough ships for him. He'd basically like his convoys being escorted by first rates if he had his way. The Royal Navy is quite happy to have them escorted by sloops and brigs. Royal Navy's thing is, there's just little privateers out. We don't really need to. We have a finite budget. We have a finite number of first rates. This is our thing. Now, where was I? Sorry about that, but, well, my girlfriend says hi. Oh, just getting all this. So, I'm probably going to repeat myself here, but I'm going to say again, Wellington would have liked first rates. He won't go and get them. But what he did get was a first-class logistics system, which could also supply him with troops and when he needed them and where he needed them, and or more importantly, for perhaps the longevity of the campaign, officers, it's more often not officers rather than men, who had returned to the UK to recoup after being badly wounded or badly ill, and that's a thing with campaigns like this. The conditions aren't always that sanitary, and you can lose a lot of people from it. Will manage to be returned fairly quickly, and that's a very useful thing if you've got officers who can also not only be returned very quickly, but we've returned fairly close to the line of combat, to where the army is. The Navy would react and make sure those personnel were dropped off in the port nearest him. They're a bit slower to move the post boat from going to Lisbon or not, but that's because they were dealing with competing requirements. The diplomatic service and the foreign office were making noises and required them to go to Lisbon. Wellington would like them to do post boats to wherever he was, and of course the whole point of a post boat is it would go very fast at this time. They'd often be armed on a flute, that is, with very little or no weaponry, and would basically put their entire reliance on speed to avoid being intercepted by pirates, privateers, and enemy cruisers, aka frigates. Just to confuse you, yes. Most of the cruisers in the Napoleonic era were technically classified as frigates. They were just going cruising. Frigate, corvette, all very old naval titles. Cruiser is far more recent. Destroyer is the most recent. Well, unless you count ocean patrol vessel. Or offshore patrol vessel, I think they're technically called now as well. I always preferred ocean patrol vessel, but I think it's technically offshore patrol vessel, which sounds far less fun. Britain might be calling them overseas patrol vessels now. Well, anyway, so the whole point is the Peninsular campaign couldn't have taken place without the support of the Navy, without them providing the logistics, without them providing quite a lot of intelligence as well about the movements of the enemy, and basically providing freedom of maneuver. Because Wellington can move his siege train everything far faster than his opponents could on land, because his siege train didn't get bogged down in roads. It didn't get caught in narrow passes by guerrillas, and it didn't have to constantly fight its way through, well, the Spanish countryside of the Iberian Peninsula, which was just not fun for the Napoleonic armies. It just wasn't. Anyway, as I said, there's a good link down below which will take you to even more information, and it's a really interesting campaign. It is. It's kind of cool as well that quite so much so early on is dependent upon logistics. that is maritime born, and how Wellington managed to work it out. How he managed to devise a system which requires a lot of communication, and he by no means gets all he wants. In fact, he really would like a lot more. But what he does get works really well for him. And it really does make the campaign actually viable. Without it, the campaign would not have been viable. The line to Torres Vedras, great system for him, but wouldn't have been viable without the sea power shoring up one flank of his, and also providing sailors and their guns, providing a lot of his heavy artillery when he hadn't been sent a siege train. So a lot of his heavy guns for quite a long time were provided by Royal Navy ships dropping them off. And then, of course, there's always Popham. Popham used to like doing raids behind the enemy lines, just causing nightmares for them, which meant that they couldn't send all their troops to fight Wellington. They had to have them stored behind lines as well to protect positions. It's just not nice. Sticking with the Iberian Peninsula, and of course, the second case study, the Spanish Civil War. And again, much as before, toodles for a second. Now, what I find fun is that HMS Glowworm, again, matters. On the morning of 22nd November, when Torricelli, Lieutenant Commander Zephropon, commanding, and Lieutenant Commander Genova attached, sighted the Republican flagship, the cruiser Miguel de Cervantes, with the battleship Gemini and other warships quietly lying at anchor in the open roads of Cartagena, the fleet was thus exposed on the advice of Captain Kuznetsov. Yes, that famous Russian officer who goes on to become an admiral and a theorist and all sorts of things, well, had advised them as an air raid, which he thought was a bigger threat, to have them out in the open roads of Cartagena and ready to sort of deploy and move and best for air defense. But this made them sitting ducks for submarine attacks. A possible shot at the battleship was prevented by HMS Glowworm, which inadvertently crossed the attack path, but the cruiser presented her broadside to two torpedoes, which ripped into her machinery space at 08:55. Efficient damage control saved the flagship, but Miguel de Cervantes was out of action for most of the war. What's interesting about the Spanish Civil War is from its beginning, it is very much a maritime conflict. And I have a few good articles for this and have some links down there, which hopefully you can get to. If you can't, they're on JSTOR, and I apologize now. But the particular paper, and I'll be talking about these papers more in a bit, there is Willard C. Frank Jr., Naval Operations Spanish Civil War. It's done in Naval War College Review, January to February 1984 edition. So volume number 37, number 1. And I'm not going to read the document to you, although I've got some quotes from Frank there. There's the one I just discussed, and there's all sorts of other ones. And there's also Munson, which is on the SimSec site, which is definitely open and easy access to all of you. But what I'm really interested in Frank has nothing to do with the writing, as good as it is, and worthwhile reading as it is. And I'm just going to move this a little bit to hopefully keep it on track. But here's the point I want to make, and I'll be explaining all about my folder in a second. But battleships, Republican and Nationalist navies both had one for pretty much most of the war until after July 37, in which case both go down to 0. The Republican Navy has 3, sometimes 2, and then later on 3 again, cruisers. The Nationalists 1 for most of 36, 2 for part of 36, for 36 and a bit of 37, and then they managed to go up to 3 for a bit, but they are soon below again. In terms of destroyers, the Republican Navy usually has 10 to 15. The Nationalist Navy, 1. More often not, they managed to get to 5 in February 1939. Submarines, the Republican Navy starts off with 12, and by the end of the war is down to 6. The Nationalists, well, apart from Italian, of course, assistance and German assistance, officially only have a peak at 3, which again are all usually former Italian boats which have already been operating in the region. Nationalists do have a significant advantage in armed merchant ships. They have 10 in December 1936, and whilst it does dip down to 8 in July 1937, they're usually right back up again to 11 or 10 from November 37 onwards. That's a significant force differential. And what's more auspicious in a way is that on the eve of the uprising, the suspicious Republican government ordered warships to patrol the straits as a precaution. Other warships of doubtful loyalty were put under surveillance. With the outbreak of the 17th of July of the attempted seizure of power, or pronunciamento, leftist crewmen spread the word from radio room to radio room and embarked upon a revolution of their own. Radical petty officers and junior officers disposed untrustworthy commanders and created a loose but surprisingly effective command network of shipboard committees, flying Republican battle ensigns. Almost the entire operational fleet quickly gathered in the straits and isolated the insurgent army of Africa in Spanish Morocco. In the Iberian Peninsula, the uprising cleaved the poorly equipped armed forces into nearly equal proportions. But the elements of the left enjoyed a superior strategic position and resources of the state, the cities, and the arsenals. In these conditions, General Mola, short of ammunition and facing a popularizing, could not break through the mountainous Guadalmara barrier to Madrid. It is most likely that had the Army of Africa been introduced into the peninsula in the first weeks, even the untutored enthusiasm of workers in arms could not have prevented the fall of Madrid and the collapse of resistance. But with the failure of the rebel pronunciamento and the collapse of Mola's strategy, the issue hung in the balance and time was with the Republic. The situation called for immediate and decisive action, and each side saw salvation in foreign assistance. The trouble is the foreign assistance they received. The fact is, the British really don't want to get involved. The British have enough problems in their own. They are dealing with a resurgent Japan in the Far East. They're dealing with Italy in North Africa, where they're sort of, to some extent, people claim they're trying to be appeasist, but they're just trying to balance commitments. With the fact they've got a fleet at the moment that they are scrabbling to rebuild, and they've got Germany, and honestly, they don't feel like taking on another massive commitment, but they do go along. The French talk a lot of talk about it, but they refuse to act unless the British do anything, which to me is kind of like saying, well, how to put it? The French Navy has enough firepower. They could have wiped out the Nationalist Navy 10 times over. And honestly, whilst they couldn't have done much, if the French had got involved on the side of the Republicans, then they would have certainly counterbalanced the Soviet influences, considering the range of Soviet influence was operating at, which might have given the Republicans a slightly better control of their navy, because Kuznetsov has them acting very, very, how do I put this politely? Well, Franks makes this comment, but he's rather polite about it. He says they're acting very conservatively, defensively. I would describe it as myopically. They are obsessed with protecting Soviet merchant ships bringing supplies in, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is stopping the nationalists getting supplies and pushing the fight to them. They have all the advantages and they squander them. And arguably, if the French had got inside, and they could have sorted it out, they could have helped them. And that could have been an interesting case of World War II, because you might have had a Spain which was pro-France, pro-Britain, involved in the Second World War. Might France have stayed in World War II if they'd had Spanish troops pouring through to back them up against the Italians and the Germans? Could have certainly been interesting. Also, of course, it could have involved the Germans having a rerun of Napoleon versus Wellington in the Peninsular campaign in Spain. Because again, whilst the very, very cold of Russia was not great tank country, when it got very, very cold for German tanks, I don't think the mountains of Spain would have been that good for them either. Anyway, leaving that all to one side, this is a classic case of there is only so much that sea power can do. But it could have done more if it was allowed to move more, and what the Italians and the Germans are using the sea power for is essential, because by turning up in as much force as they do turn up in, even under the cloud neutrality, they manage to keep an eye on the Republican units and report their positions to the nationalists. They manage to clear paths so that their submarines can get in and launch attacks, which are critical. They manage to do all sorts of things. And there is other hyperbole which goes on around. Sorry, Midge. There is other hyperbole which goes on around it, but honestly, there was a lot of opportunities which were missed. And mostly it's down to him. He's a very good political admiral, and he is very good at perhaps grand strategy theory, depending on your reading of his book, which is somewhere not far from me, I think. I've put it down somewhere. The question is where? It's bright and it's yellow. Must be over there. Anyway, it's an interesting book, and you'll find it in previous videos discussed. The most recent, Some More Admirals. But on a whole, Soviet naval advisors were absolutely the Republic's biggest disadvantage. Oh. Korea. Korea is, we are going to expand and we're going to discuss, but we're going to do it slightly differently because now, Korea's geography, a peninsula of a mountainous central region and thousands of islands littering the coastline, made the country particularly susceptible to influence from the sea. This does not mean that a maritime campaign is easy. Korea's east coast is characterized by deep waters and a few islands, making the area excellent for naval bombardment and establishment of offshore raiding bases. The west coast, however, is characterized by shallow waters, extensive mudflats, and islands, and large tidal movements that not only made navigation difficult, but also made it highly suitable for mine use by the north, a tactic that was employed with a measure of success. Most RAN operations were conducted along the difficult west coast. At the outbreak of hostilities, Shoalhaven was deployed as the Australian Naval contingent to the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, while Bataan was en route to relieve her. Both ships were placed at General MacArthur's disposal on 29th of June 1950 and were immediately allocated to the Commonwealth Naval Force, commanded by Rear Admiral William Andrews, RN, which was later augmented by ships from Canada, New Zealand, Netherlands, and France. The contingent operated primarily on the west coast, though a number of frigates, including Shoalhaven, also performed escort duties in the east. This is by Peter Dovik, The Korean War, which is published by, I think, Defense Media Network. I'm not sure. I think so. I know USN Heritage is the first one. I probably have put it in order. Hold on, so possibly that's the sea services in Korea. Or that could be Australian. I'm being confused by my own references. I do apologize. I've got them all in paper form, so I'll check them before I publish this all. But it's kind of interesting that, the whole options of Korea. But for discussion of Korea, that is a far better background than a load of text. It really is. It's Bataan and Bataan. So, the Korean War is an interesting one, and it is kind of fun that I can go off my head. We, of course, always remember Incheon. There is also examples where HMS Unicorn, yes, that very special, not an aircraft carrier, forward aviation support ship, likes to get in gunnery range and do gunnery practice on various shores. Battleships also get in gunnery range, and when they get engaged by shore batteries, return fire fully formed. Tribal class destroyers like Bataan there, mainly the Canadian ones, HMCS Hyder especially, the fighting a ship in the Canadian Navy, enjoy getting reputations for destroying railways and trains. In fact, in Hyder's case, the first train she tries to attack manages to escape, and that sufficiently motivates her for the rest of the war that, frankly, nothing else escapes afterwards. And I mean nothing else escapes afterwards. It's one of those scenarios where you're looking at it and going, ouch. Now, the thing about the Korean War is that you have a UN mandate, which is very useful. You can't really do sea basing like you might like to do, but you've also got a very narrow peninsula. And it's, again, terrible, terrible terrain. So your best aircraft support is going to come from aircraft carriers. Often does, because they can move forward with the forces. So airfields being destroyed, they need to be repaired and replaced. The aircraft carriers are fairly safe. In terms of the fighting ashore, you can land, and of course, sea provides strategic mobility, which allows for Incheon, but also allows for other operations and resupply. All those troops which are in Korea are basically supplied from the sea, and without it, they just wouldn't have been having any fun at all. Well, they probably wouldn't have been having any operations at all. Now, joyously, I have an article here written by a gentleman you should have heard of, hopefully, Arleigh Burke. If anyone's not quite sure who he was such an important admiral the US Navy named a class of destroyers after them, probably not realizing those destroyers would become synonymous with America and would still be the stalwarts of their fleets to this day, and still actually be in production. US global strategy will veer away from ground force commitments and fixed land bases and towards a new sea strategy to exercise our diplomacy and contribute to peace and stability in the world, as well as protect the vital interests of the United States and to meet our treaty commitments. Other new factors are emerging. And then he writes this in 1970. And so this is 20 years after the Korean War. And it starts off there, but, you know, he goes through the various things and the whole way through of why he thinks this is the case. There are four basic possibilities in the use of our naval forces in the future. First, each nation could operate its naval forces solely as national naval forces. Second, we could form alliances and establish the role that each navy would play within the alliance. Third, we could integrate all or most of our naval forces into United Nations Naval Command. Fourth, we could have multinational cooperation naval efforts based on regional orientation and mutual interests. Believe it or not, he uses Korea as an example of each of these in terms of how it can be worked. It's a cool article. In fact, I have to say there's a dozen cool articles here which I could read sections from all out, and probably would, but you know, then we'd never be out of here. So, Korea is about logistics, primarily. We can talk about the high explosive, we can talk about all the other things, but it just wouldn't have been possible without the naval support of the logistics. It meant the forces that turned up could be turned up with their heavy equipment and could be put where they needed to be. Whether those were Commonwealth forces, US forces, whoever forces which turned up, barring the Chinese, turned up by sea. The Chinese, of course, flowed across a river, so, you know, they still came by water, just not sea. But definitely an example of naval intervention. Now, how do the videos get made? Well, this is an interesting question because I have been asked it, and knowing this was going to be a bit of a long video, I thought I'd include something about it. So, there are the slides and all these things are put together, and as a rule, I try to start the research about 2 weeks before I present the video. So I like to know my topics 2 weeks in advance. And I prepare this, the folder of doom. I have about 6 of them on the run at each time. And they will be kept until a week after the presentation has gone up, and then they'll be shredded. They'll go in recycling, and it'll get filled up with the next one in turns documents. And this contains all the downloaded articles that are relevant to this topic. Now, I produce these in hard copy because then I can go over them and make notations, and I can do all the other things. But this is the sort of quality which I'm going for. I prefer to use my JSTOR Access account because I can. But I do get other things as well. I do the full regular Google search because if you don't do the Google search, then you're not going to find out half the stuff other people are going to quote at you. So you might as well do it with a Google search. Secondly, do a JSTOR search and a few other sort of searches to try and find relevant materials. and it's to work it through and work through the various types of material available. Now, once I have the articles, I also go to my book collection, and I go through the books and I make sure I find the right books, and where they are, I'll bring them out. Because I like to have a mixture of sources, but also because the books and some of the articles are far easier for you to go and find than it is necessary to find all these articles, because not everyone has a JSTOR account and not everyone has access to them. And the trouble is with journal articles is that there are quite a lot of them which are hidden behind paywalls, and some of those paywalls are very expensive for an individual article. Thank you, Kingston University, for allowing me to use my JSTOR account. Anyway, once I have all these put together, I'll do a first draft of the slides, print them off, doodle over them, then do a second draft of the slides, all done on PowerPoint. Then they're turned into JPEGs, which are mounted into a video, and I'll do a practice video. Yes, I do a practice. I know it might not always seem like it, but I do. I'll do at least one, and then I will start doing recordings. Now, I like to record in one go and one take, although I have to admit I have now found the pause button, and I have started using it rather than stopping recording and restarting from the beginning, because that was proving very, very extended to try and get things done. And eventually, I produce. Although we, if you include the fluffy research assistant who's downstairs, leave a moment, nuts, mozzarella, woolly, Gigi, I forget, and Admiral. No, I don't forget. Smoothie. If you can guess which ones were presents from my girlfriend and which ones I've had for years, there's no prize. It's just you'll know me far too well. Anyway, so that is where everything comes from, and everything is research, because as much as I would love to be and be able to claim that I am a superstar expert in everything, I'm not. I have to go and do research on many of these things. There are some topics I can present off the top of my head and have written the slides 5 minutes beforehand, but those are few and far between, and honestly, I would still prefer to have done at least 1 or 2 practice runs, because I think that produces a better quality. Anyway, we're going to say that little interlude is over, and we're going to skip onto the next topic, which is the Indonesia-Malaysia case study. Now, on the military dimension, a low-intensity conflict ensued that pitted Indonesia supported communist guerrillas and regular Indonesian army units against the British-led Commonwealth forces. The long Malaysian-Indonesian border on the island of Borneo constituted the main theatre of operations. The chief military activity centered on the Commonwealth defense of North Borneo and Sarawak against Indonesian cross-border raids. At sea, the Commonwealth navies adopted a policy of restraint to minimize the possibility of exacerbating strained tensions with Indonesia. As a matter of policy, Commonwealth warships stayed outside the 12-mile limit, which Indonesia claimed as its territorial waters. In any confrontation with Indonesian warships, British and Commonwealth captains were only allowed to use force in self-defense, or after ensuring that the Indonesians had opened fire first. Despite the former British position of recognizing only a 3-mile limit on territorial seas, then they had effectively conceded the Indonesian 12-mile claim. Britain, however, continued to uphold its right of innocent passage through Indonesian claim waters, despite the onset of the confrontation. Royal Naval vessels routinely transited through the Suez Straits after gaining assent from the Foreign Office, which was responsible for political assessments of Indonesian reaction to British naval movements. The Foreign Office had approved the transits due to the lack of any adverse reaction by Indonesian authorities and asserted the risk of opposition as low. However, the benign naval environment changed drastically as the confrontation took a dangerous turn in August and September 1964. When Sukarno expanded the conflict by landing troops in Peninsular Malaysia, Hitero untouched by the undeclared war in Borneo jungles except for isolated acts of terrorism and subversion. So, interesting enough, the Malaysian confrontation is not really remembered for its particular its maritime dimension. It's remembered as a fight in jungles, dirty, nasty fighting. But the maritime dimension is actually a major part of it as a war, but also a major part of it as a legacy. It had to be contested, and it was contested, and it turned hot. And that is where quite a lot of the precedent which is used for confronting China today in the South China Sea comes from, is actually the Malaysia-Indonesian confrontation, which is a nice way for saying a undeclared war that went on. Again, there were no more sloops by this point. Sloops weren't part of navies, so what was used for the small inshore role? Well, as anyone who's heard me describing the stories about Michael Clapp and his early life, you'll know it was minesweepers. It was the small boats. And the Ton class really do get involved. They are critical to many of these operations, going along festooned with as many machine guns as their particular lieutenant commanders could cram on them. The Indonesian Malaysian-Indonesian confrontation is remarkable in two respects. One, sea power enables the Commonwealth to pretty much control everything about it. Yes, the Indonesians occasionally manage to escalate things. And yes, that's annoying when they do. It is really annoying when they do. But, as a rule, they don't get to do that much. They don't get to set the pace of the conflict. And this is the point. The British, and to an extent, the Malaysians and Singaporeans and other and other allied nations do get to set the pace of the conflict because of their control of the sea. They also get to supply their personnel when they wish, and they get to withdraw them and include them as much as they wish. They can move them in very flexibly, and they do. It's also great for smaller nations in the Commonwealth Alliance to be able to contribute what they can and contribute knowing that their contribution is likely to come home to them, which was the good advantage of the naval forces. Sending in land forces has the risk of them getting killed. Sea forces mostly had a lot of high-stakes brinkmanship, but nothing actually happened. Sorry, it's one annoying thing with it doing this sort of thing, these huge ring binders full of documents. I need more I need more dividers. I keep running out of them. I keep getting nicked by someone down the way. Who also needs a lot of them, to be fair, but I don't know. Sisters. Even elder ones. What's hers is hers, and what's mine is hers as well, if she fancies some of the things. Although, there again, to be fair, she wasn't eating gluten-free food the whole time. She has an allergy, so she has to have gluten-free food. I'd probably be nicking her chocolate cake right now. It does actually look quite nice chocolate cake for gluten-free. Anyway, back to this one. Britain and Indonesia approached the brink of war at the height of the Sunda Straits crisis in September 1964. Using newly released declassified archival records, this study reviews the supposed British deterrence success. The factors behind successful Indonesian deterrence during the crisis contradict the prevalent view that statesmen should refrain from brinkmanship, since they are unlikely to achieve their political goals at minimum cost themselves. Brinkmanship and deterrent success during the Anglo-Indonesian Sunda Strait crisis, 1964 to 1966, by To Bon Kwa, a graduate of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Even provides an email address here, which I won't list out, but it's cool. Did a lot of work in the National Archives. And it's a very thorough study. And what was interesting is this, when I found this study, which was, and that's the great find about JSTOR, it tells you when you downloaded it. I downloaded it. I did. Yeah, I downloaded it on the 15th. It's one of the ones I found later still. And it gives all the details of the conflict, but most importantly, it gets into the full deterrence measure and how they were deterring it, and how they were facing off against each other. And the fact is, brinkmanship is able to be done when you have capable forces. Presiding as he calls this, prelude to crisis, the year of living dangerously. On the occasion of Indonesia's Independence Day on the 17th of August, 1964, Sukarno declared 1964 as the year of living dangerously. He backed his words of action that night, landing about 100 infiltrators near Pontian Besar, West Johor, in Malaysia. The British were astounded by the surprisingly overt step by the Indonesians. High Commissioner Lord Anthony Heard surmised that the infiltrators intended to establish guerrilla bases with long-term objective of rallying anti-Malaysian elements and setting up revolutionary government on Malaysian soil. The landing party, however, was quickly captured. The military significance of the infiltration was not lost, and Britain took serious notice of Crown's escalations of tensions. Basically, Britain wanted to avoid more experience than what they had going on in Burma and various other places, so they looked to a different methodology. And it was interesting that which particular use? Basically, the British took a very strong line and threatened to retaliate against Indonesian bases. Went to the United Nations Security Council, to all sorts of things, but it becomes very clear that Britain is going to need to make a statement. And they make that statement by sending HMS Victorious, along with destroyers, as many as she could get her hands on, and as bigger destroyers as were available, transited Sunda Straits on 27th August 1964. And basically, it was the British going, yes, you have a lot of people, and yes, you're very committed, but we have a metric SHIT load of high explosive and fury that's able to sail very close to you. Just imagine what she could do if we let her off the leash. The following day, the day following the southward passage of Victorious, Indonesian Deputy Foreign Minister Suharto summoned British Charge of Affairs to complain the British notice of naval passage was too casual. Yes. That the British had been too casual in saying they were going to. That is classic. We have no power at all to do anything here. And it's not nice. You don't get me wrong. This is a big nation basically bullying a little nation. But that was a little nation which was bullying an even smaller nation. Now, we're going to sit there and there are going to be people who are listening to this video who are going to go, but that's not right. That's not the way it should be. The world should be getting together and sorting these things out peacefully. Wars and confrontations are not started by rational people or people in a rational mindset. Someone who has said that he is starting, it's going to be a year of living dangerously, is not exactly going to be mollified by words. It's going to have to be pretty much in his face. And even with the sheer firepower the British were putting on display, he still kept launching spoiling attacks, and you end up with a guerrilla war par excellence going on in the jungle. Although it's par excellence from the counter-guerrilla tactics more than the guerrilla warfare tactics. In the end, possibly the quantity of Gurkhas who were dispatched. On the 2nd of September 1964, the day following the parachute landings at Navies, Foreign Minister Submarino informed the Australian ambassador to Jakarta that Indonesia would refuse passage to the victorious naval task force on its return voyage to Singapore. All leave for Indonesian military personnel was also cancelled. Jakarta's brinkmanship was a challenge to the British to practice the claiming the rights of warships in peacetime to innocent passage through international straits. Without any access to Indonesian documentary evidence, it is not possible to pinpoint with certainty the motivation behind Jakarta's actions, but Subarino's pronouncement, however, was consistent with his government's recent move to tighten control over naval moves in the waters it claimed following the earlier passage of an American carrier battle group. It is likely that Jakarta's policymakers were caught by surprise when they discovered that the southward passage involved an aircraft carrier, since British notifications were always couched in vague terms. If indeed this was the case, then it explains why Indonesian authorities did not raise objections to the first transit of British warships when notified. It is significant that a passage by the task force was the first such British naval transit of similar straits that year. So basically, the first time we turned up with a mighty force. The choice of an aircraft carrier and the timing of the transit occurred in the wake of the Pontian landings were probably perceived in Jakarta as signals of British resolve and a serious infringement of the Indonesian territorial integrity. Considering the Sukarno had publicly condemned US bombing of North Vietnam following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, it's not surprising that he also responded so forcefully to the Royal Navy's infringement. British secret intelligence sources confirmed that the Gulf of Tonkin incident has put the wind up Indonesians. Such a connection was publicly expressed on 4 September in nationalist newspaper Sula Indonesia, which accused Britain of trying to create a second Tonkin and Gulf incident by engaging in provocative naval maneuvers in Indonesian-claimed waters in response to Pontian landings. Well, this is direct confrontation going on, and as a rule, especially nations which are flirting dangerously with the concept of personal dictatorships, do not like you not responding to their bullying, backing down, because all they tend to have is their bullying. Britain has been carrying out gunboat diplomacy. We believe that in the tense situation at the time, they wanted to provoke another Tonkin affair. Contrary to Indonesian accusations, Thornycroft and his military advisers treated the passage of HMS Victorious as a separate and distinct issue from the matter of British retaliation in the event of further Indonesian attack against West Malaysia. As far as the British policymakers were concerned, what was at stake was the right of innocent passage and the impact of British military stature if the right was not enforced. Now, I am fairly sure that's what they write down in the official documents, because this is a nation which is long used to the idea of writing down official documents, which by this point, especially in the 1960s, they know are going to be read someday by someone in the National Archives. However, considering what Indonesia and Malaysia had been up to, you would have to be a freaking idiot not to think trailing an aircraft a carrier battle group past their coast was not going to have an impact. The Indonesians also kept Washington informed of their intentions to close the Sunda Straits to Victorious and its escorts. This led to frantic activity in the White House, and Budney advised London to consider carefully the ship's proposed return voyage. British diplomats opined the administration is fearful lest we overreach ourselves militarily and then call the United States for assistance. Robert W. Cromer, a National Security Council chief staff member, and Marshall Green, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, thought Brits would like to provoke a nice mess into which we'd necessarily be sucked. Cromer's assessment was that Britain was miscalculating Sukarno's resolve in meeting any British response, arguing that a show of force would not deter him, but instead make him escalate rather than back down. Shrewd Indonesian move cleverly utilised the dovish Americans to bring their hawkish British ally to heel. Whitehall was determined that Sukarno would not get away with another affront to British prestige. In demonstration of their resolve, the British were prepared to risk the loss of the Victorious to deny him any political victory. Thornycroft, backed by Chief of Naval Staff Sir David Lucre and Chief of Defence Staff Admiral Louis Batten, argued that if HMS Victorious did not return via the Straits, we should suffer a substantial political defeat, with unpredictable effects on our military position in the Far East. This is starting to sound like the Falkland Islands. British officials on the spot disagreed, however. Sir Varel Beg, Commander-in-Chief British Forces in Far East, expressed doubts over the proposal to force passage through the Sunda Straits. The Naval Task Force, he argued, was too weak to defend itself against attacks or strike at the Indonesians. Head concurred with Beg's recommendation that Victorious should not return via the Sunda Straits, and he disagreed with Whitehall's assessment of the potential loss of prestige. I cannot see the Indonesians can make any serious catapult out of the fact that Victorious did not return the same way she came. Indonesians already have worldwide reputation as colossal liars, and for her to interpret this as a sign of British reputation and thus loss of face to our military in Southeast Asia seems to me far-fetched. Eventually, though, they do decide to. And how they decide to do this, Luke ends up acknowledging the above dangers, but remained adamant that Victorious must force the passage to drive home the principle. To placate Beg, the military chiefs decided to station a second aircraft carrier, the HMS Centaur, in the area to provide air and radar cover for the Naval Task Force. Concurrently, military reinforcements were rushed to Singapore to enable him to retaliate against any further Indonesian provocation in West Malaysia. Thornycroft ends up winning the argument, and basically then they'd made this decision. Then 2 days later, Jakarta informs Britain that its navy would be conducting exercises in the Sunda Straits, raising the prospect of a clash with the Royal Navy. Jakarta's escalation and further demonstration of resolve led to a new round of policy debates in London. Thornycroft reviewed the force passages issued with Ministry of Defence, Foreign Commonwealth Office, and Commonwealth Relations Office officials. Begg's arguments resurfaced, and officials counselling that the opinions of the men on the spot should be seriously considered. Head's endorsement of Begg's views carried weight since he was a political heavyweight who knew his job well, as he had been Defence Secretary during Anthony Eden's government. Swayed by his views, Thornycroft decided Victorious would not transit the Sunda Strait, but instead would provide air cover for her two destroyers, making the force passage. So now you have two carriers providing air cover, Centaur and Victorious, and you have the destroyers going through. As Britain and Indonesia approached the brink of war, the latter sought to retain the initiative by offering an alternative that allowed victorious to return via Lombok Straits on account of Indonesian naval maneuvers in the Sunda Straits, i.e., please redact, please. Mackie has written that the Indonesian offer was a face-saving gesture for both sides. That was Mackie's Confrontation, page 262, apparently, according to the reference in this one. And the Indonesians prevented the British naval task force from passage through the Sunda Straits, while the British maintained their right of innocent passage through a different route, i.e., it would be a face-saving option for both. It is clear, however, that Jakarta did not offer the compromise from a position of weakness. The British Chiefs of Staff noted the Indonesian military forces were in high state of alert. They were. But as a rule, it carries on, and it's brinkmanship. And sorry, I can get dropped in. It's a very well written article. But it's brinkmanship on a level which has to be considered. You've got both sides putting forward their forces. You've got Britain, which is still a major power in the 90s. Well, it's a major power to this day, but in the nicest way, it was a really major power. You're talking deploying 2 aircraft carriers, and they're not even sweating about it. They're actually counselling that if they lose HMS Victorious, it isn't the end of the world. If they lose 2 destroyers, it isn't the end of the world. They are doing this because they have to, and it's over. Arguably over face, but also because they realize they are dealing with someone who is going to be emboldened by any perceived success. And that's the problem. When you're dealing with a personality which is professed that he's going for a year of living dangerously, any perceived success is likely to make that year more dangerous for you. Very much more dangerous for you. But also what's interesting is the relationships that's going on and that go on in this particular time between the Foreign Office, the people on the people down there in command, and the diplomats. The fact you have to bring in all the experts, all the politicians are getting involved and debating this. This isn't a we are presenting an operation and then yay or nay. This is we are all involved in this discussion, and I find that kind of interesting when I'm reading up these accounts. That's why I get so absorbed in this one, because this particular account in this particular article is very, very good at this. Because I don't imagine you perhaps get the same level of involvement in modern debates, in modern high-level decisions. I have a feeling it's far more options are presented and the debates take place at a lower level. And I wonder if that's a good idea. I can see it being cleaner and perhaps making the process easier and possibly even quicker for senior elected officials. But it means also that they don't understand necessarily the exact process of what is going on. And that means they might not have as much familiarity with what the potential consequences are. Let's be honest, there are 3 things though you probably never want to realize how are made: sausages, laws, and foreign policy. Especially in times of debate of great stress. an hour. Right. Case study 5 of 6. There are 6. So, Phoenix Squadron. Belize, or British Honduras at the time, is not a very big place. And Guatemala basically considered it should be it. You notice there is a certain theme turning up to tonight's discussions. When you do not want to deploy large amounts of military force, you send it by sea. You're all wondering what number 6 is going to be. It would have been too easy to be the one you probably think it's going to be. There are so many different things, so many different events, and that involve British Honduras and Guatemala. There is another scenario where some Harriers are flown across the world and deployed there. The British have troops there, all sorts of things. The trouble is, Belize, British Honduras is not particularly wide. It's not got much in the way of strategic depth, and that roadmap you see there is pretty much still the roadmap there. Now, the justification Guatemala has for declaring war is the lack of the British building a road, apparently, which they promised to do in a treaty, which would have connected the Pacific with the Caribbean, or them with the Caribbean. I read it and thought, my lord, if that's your pretext for a war, that you guys haven't built a road, that's... Instead of sending in the army, you should be sending in the army engineers and going, we'll build the road. If that's really what you want, rather than fighting a war, it's a blooming flimsy pretext. But they use it as a justification to threaten Belize on many occasions. It's one of the reasons why in parts of their constitution they'd written in Belize or British Honduras was the 23rd Department of Guatemala. And, you know, they do all sorts of interesting things. There is a lovely book about the particular one I'm talking about in 1972, where pretty much the Royal Navy goes, ouch, send a carrier. HMS Ark Royal is exercising off the east coast of the United States, causing all sorts of fun. At one point, an air defense pilot, is sent up to intercept a ferry gannet because Air Defense Command is not quite sure what those signals are. And he comes across this contra-rotating propeller powered aircraft just oozing steam and smoke and out of its pistons and all sorts of things. And all he can see in terms of human life is a pilot sitting in the flight seat, smoking a pipe and reading a book. And when asked what he has found, he responds to Air Traffic Control, Defense Command, I found God. The advantage of the Ark Royal, though, was that she was armed with Buccaneers and Phantoms and Gannets. And a few helicopters as well, I think, from memory. So she has a fairly good air group. And so the Guatemalans are all getting ready for invade, and they have a wonderful air force of P-51 Mustangs and these sort of things, and troops up, and the Royal Navy races Ark Royal down from the east coast of the United States to Belize, to British Honduras, and message is sent to the Guatemalans. You do anything, we will bomb you to the kingdom come. They go, we don't believe you. Next day, low-flying death appears. 2 buccaneers make a run straight down the length of Belize. We can come here. Yes, there's a small tripwire of British forces here. There is the Belizean zone armed forces here. They will be supported. They will have air support, and there will be nothing you can do about it. I think the next day the Buccaneers are joined by some Phantoms because they're finally in Phantom range as well. But the point is, this is approaching Armageddon in comparison to what Guatemala could put in the field was getting closer. And they had nothing which could really match up to it. And it makes them withdraw. And it doesn't require the deployment of a footprint ashore. It doesn't look big and threatening military deployment, so it manages to keep the South American states largely on side enough that Guatemala still ends up increasingly isolated over this issue. And that's important. If Britain had been forced to deploy brigades of troops and large numbers of sort of forces, by the time they do deploy Harriers and an increased land presence, well, that's a couple of years down the road, and Guatemalan intransigence has carried on for a couple more years, and the public opinion and, most importantly, the national opinions of most Latin American countries is firmly on the side of Belizean independence and Belizean sovereignty. So at that point, the British can afford to deploy land forces. But in 1972, that would have caused a lot of political complications, a lot of problems. So HMS Ark Royal went and did her duty. And did it very nicely. And most importantly, did look cute while doing it. Also, Buccaneers, very, very cute aircraft for doing it, because these, of course, were originally designed as an offset strategy for dealing with Russian Svel'dov-class cruisers. Yes, you've built the world-beating cruiser. We have built a world-beating strike aircraft which can attack your cruiser. Be very precise, fly very low, pretty darn fast. And that long range. And it works. What were the weaknesses of it? Well, there are a lot of weaknesses of it. The fact is, if the Guatemalans had really pushed, yes, we could have bombed them. Couldn't have done much. Which is where next case study comes up. This is the one where which there is really the least written. In fact, there is so little written that I do not even have a journal article about it. I've been hunting one. Operation Palliser is the one I want to focus on. The British react to the civil war raging in Sierra Leone, and, well, sparking, suddenly getting very hot, by first off deploying enhanced first power response group. And it reaches the point at which they need to deploy something, they deploy them. The thing is, they can afford to deploy them really, really light. They go in very, very light with minimal stores and minimal supplies. They can do that because the Amphibious Ready Group, which has been on exercise in France, the French, and the Mediterranean, is already on its way, carrying a lot more heavy equipment, and illustrious with Sea Harriers, lots of Sea Kings, and HMS Argyle is also on the way. They also have 4 Chinooks sent in. 2 of them managed to do a 3,000-mile long-range deployment, and which is one of the longest helicopter deployments done up to that point. But the interesting thing is, of course, with the Queen Elizabeth class, that wouldn't have to happen. But the thing is, with an illustrious, you can get fairly close in shore and be quite happy with it. I wouldn't want to bring a Queen Elizabeth class that close into shore. And that's the point about HMS Ocean. She turns up with a load more Commando Sea Kings and no submarine planning. And what they basically do is they posh them at sea. They send some equipment ashore to support the paras, But the Marines are posted at sea, so if Britain did suddenly need to go hot, they have got a light brigade there. Yes, it's only got 2 maneuver groups, 2 battalion-sized formations, but one of those is the Paras and one of those is 42 Commando. I don't think either's going to face much trouble. I really don't. Certainly, from the thing is, the experience in there was that they could actually do the fighting job when they needed to. And it's rather interesting when you consider what we're talking about with the littoral strike ships and all these sort of formations. That actually, the formation you're looking at in the littoral strike group, littoral strike ship, this sort of enhanced company. Well, it's not too different from what initially, although it was 2 companies of them, landed by the Paras. But the thing was, that was only acceptable in that scenario because they knew, A, there were more companies coming, and there was going to be slightly more equipment sent to them, and B, there was a lot more equipment coming in terms of the amphibious ready group. And then what's most interesting is that they keep the Marines postured offshore, and then when it comes time to withdraw the paras, because pretty much you want to pull them out because you need to take them home so they can resume their role with what is a NATO tasking as the rapid reaction force. So the Marines go in and take over their role instantly. And the Marines, of course, have acclimatized while sitting on ship offshore, have been very close to all the intelligence going on, have been able to get onto that timeline, onto that, all that experience, managed to already conduct several exercises to show they were there as presence. And now the Marines are shore. And there is a seamless transition. And that gives you time, because of using those two high readiness groups, to train up and prepare and work out your strategy for what will become Operation Kokuri and Operation Barras, or rather the basis for them, the ongoing commitments which lead to them. And it's all thanks to the speed with which Operation Palliser was conducted. You could deploy a carrier. You could deploy a large amphibious ship with a full squad commando-based response group. So it wasn't a company. It was a full command. Now, admittedly, again, no APCs, no really heavy vehicles, but enough firepower it could do what it needed to do in that scenario. And this is, the 4 Chinooks were really critical. And I have to say, I think that's part of the reason which has driven the size of the Queen Elizabeth class, the need to put Chinooks aboard them. Because Chinooks are a major part and are going to be a major part of British strategic lift for many, many years. The thing is, though, that means unless you're going to do a 3,000 plus mile self-deployment, you need ships which can take them, and they are not going to be small, because Chinooks aren't small. To be honest, the Sea King Mark IVs, the Junglies, weren't small either. The operation was quick and decisive, and Tony Blair's government... The trouble is with Sierra Leone, is it goes so well, it both lulls Tony Blair and his government into a full sense of security, and also has a similar effect on David Cameron's government, because when they are talking about doing the operations they do in Libya, they are talking about the Sierra Leone model, and they're forgetting the big difference. In Sierra Leone, Britain deployed boots on the ground. Britain deployed a carrier with Sea Harriers and lots of Sea Kings to provide air support and provide reconnaissance and airborne early warning, which the radar helicopters were used, although not for airborne early warning. They deployed an amphibious ready group, which became that. They basically deployed what is 2/3 of a brigade of troops. They worked out that if they wanted to take full control of the UN military operation, etc., and provide the commander, they would need to deploy a brigade. And they actually did tab what that third battalion would be to make the force up to a brigade if they needed to do it. I think they're planning on sending Princess of Wales Royal Regiment, probably them. I think that was what the one which was tabbed. I know it was one of the ones which are sort of one of the infantry units which is able to use infantry fighting vehicles because they thought they might need, especially if they were going a more cavalry mix, if they were going to be dealing with a wider area operation, as they have two very heavily armed but infantry light mobility vehicle groups. Anyway, so summary: was it worth it? Was naval intervention in these cases worth it? Well, that's up to you. My instinct with Indonesia is that's always a bit of a iffy one. I think it was worth it because it allowed it preserved Malaysia, and it pushed back against Indonesian claims, which would have set a precedent which would be reinforcing Chinese might is right now in the South China Sea if it hadn't been pushed back against. But I also think a lot was risked and a lot of cost was incurred for what was, comparatively speaking, a sideshow. But I think it's something we're going to have to think about the more we start re-engaging with the wider world. Britain has got used, and quite a lot of nations get used to, their own particular areas in the world. America is having to start to get used to it because traditionally that America was such an overwhelming power for many years, there was virtually no confrontation other than with particular nations in particular areas. Now, whilst America is still an overwhelming power, they have to face the realities that they do have to deal with the court of international opinion, public opinion. And that places a restraint on some of the things they can do versus nations which are less worried about public opinion. It's almost a freedom. The freedom from worrying about what the public will say about you. But curious enough, this is where I think naval intervention, especially a la Sierra Leone and Korea and the Peninsular War, and to an extent the Spanish Civil War, offer a rather advantageous approach. Sea-based intervention, if you consider Sierra Leone, we were able to base diplomats and everything off on the ships. So they were all safe. They could go and do diplomacy during the day, but if we wanted them safe at night, they were safe at night. If we wanted to have a discreet meeting with people and we wanted to bring them together on neutral ground, we could have them all come out to our ships. It's advantageous. In the Indonesian confrontation, we managed to combine Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, all sorts of people ended up showing up and helping us out. Why? Because in the end, using sea power, it was contained, it was limited. And it was limited in such a way that it allowed Malaysia to build up its own forces and move to the front. It didn't force Malaysia, which was in a nascent state, to suddenly have to deal with a major war. They could take their time and build up and steady themselves and ready themselves and then go to war. And that's important. And then it leads you to the last question. It's rather artificial question to start thinking of it in the way of, was it worth it? Because what else other options are there? You think about the Korean War, what other options were there? You think about Belize in 1972. Yes, there are other options. Yes, Britain could have gone heavy-handed and deployed masses of forces. Wouldn't have been possibly that quick, but could have done it relatively quickly. Definitely could have got some paratroopers out there in the time. But the trouble is, putting boots on the ground would have a major impact on political opinion. Which suggests actually that political opinion conditions are not new. They've just grown stronger. Or maybe that's because, whereas it used to be said that a lie could get halfway around the world before the truth had even put its pants on, now a lie can circle the world 3 or 4 times over before the truth has even been tweeted. Naval intervention, at its base point, is about control. If you are using sea power, you are able to control something. Whether it's in the Peninsular War, where you were able to control the logistics and the flow of support, or Korea, where you were able to control, again, logistics, but more importantly, control the fire power. That can really make a difference to your forces and give you the ability to counterbalance overwhelming numbers ashore, especially for nations which don't want to commit large land armies. And that's the base advantage of naval intervention. You're able to control it, and you don't have to commit necessarily everything to have an impact. Although, as the Indonesian confrontation shows, sometimes you do have to be prepared to risk it all. And sometimes the mere threat that you might be prepared to risk it all forces people to communicate and make concessions and talk. And sometimes talking is what you need them to do, because talking is what allows you to resolve it. So that's where brinkmanship comes in naval diplomacy. Because most of the time, it forces people to end up having a conversation because they try to search for a solution which doesn't involve them getting themselves blown up. Most of the time. Although you do have to worry about someone who suggested that you're looking forward to a year of living dangerously. Yeah. Any political leader who says that should probably be immediately removed from office. So what have we got next? Well, today it's Thursday, 23rd of July, From the Sea. And Tuesday, it's submarines, which is why there are so many submarine books around me and And 30th of July, pre-tribals. Fun times. Then we've got August. So much cool stuff going on then. And even more stuff in August. Where else you can find me? Twitter, Patreon, and Global Maritime History. And this is going to be 100 minutes long. So, thank you to all my subscribers. Thank you to all my patrons. I know I charged it's the excessive £3 I set for the patron, but I hope I deliver value for money. And thank you to everyone who shares and likes. It really matters. And thank you to everyone who's pre-ordered my book. You're all superstars. Thank you. See you later for the live. Thank you. Thank you. Don't forget Discord, link down below.